Hi, my name is João, and in this video I'm going to present a paper recently published at the International Parallel and Distributed Processing Symposium. The paper is entitled Improving Transactional Code Generation via Variable Annotation and Barrier Elision. This work is a joint effort of between myself, Bruno, which is also a PhD student from Unicamp, Professor Alexandro, and my supervisor, Professor Guido. Before I dive into the details of the paper, we first need to recognize some hard truths about parallel programming. The first one is about the machines we have today, and most of them, and not to say all of them, are multi-core or many-core machines. And that's not going to change anytime soon because in the day-to-day activities, we need performance. And because of that need of performance, and because performance is not easy to extract on those machines, we need to work really hard to extract performance and to actually have parallelism. And unfortunately, most concurrent programming approaches are not easy to use or not very effective for general problems. In fact, most problems are not trivial to parallelize. One viable alternative is transactional memory. In order to understand why transactional memory is a very interesting and effective alternative, and to show why synchronization is hard, I'm going to present a challenge that was made in the C++ conference back in 2016 that proposed a challenge where it was asked for an implementation of an atomic multi-structure update. The first question in the challenge was, is it possible to implement this operation in a fashion that is both fast and scalable? The answer is yes. The second question was, can you do it without using transactional memory? The answer was also yes. However, in order to accomplish that, you need a 33-page-long paper to explain the solution. 97 slides presented in a 1-hour talk to explain and show all the details on how to solve the problem. And the solution was written by a software engineer with more than 30 years of experience. This concrete example shows how complicated and how tricky synchronization can be. The same problem can be very easily solved using transactional memory. Let's say we have two trees, as we show in the slides, 3A and 3B, and we want to atomically move one element from A to B or vice versa. If you already have a function or a method that performs this operation in a single tree or in each tree, you can just wrap those calls within a transactional block, and then the whole problem is solved because the transactional memory guarantees atomicity by default. So using just 3 lines of code, we can solve the same problem that required a lot of thinking to solve. Similarly, we can also move from the other direction from 3B to 3A, as easy as we did from A to B. You just need to wrap the 2 calls from deleting and inserting elements from each tree within a transactional block. However, transactional memory also have some issues. One of them is related to how you use transactional memory. Today, it's quite hard to use transactional memory because programmers either need to learn new instructions that are available on commodity processors, or they need to learn APIs to explicitly add calls to transactional memory libraries. If they don't need to learn, or they don't want to learn those instructions or APIs, they need to rely on compiler support. And this compiler support is only available on the GNU C compiler for C and C++. In this graph, I'm showing the speedup on the y-axis, and the x-axis show a set of applications from STAMP, which is a standard benchmark used for transactional memory evaluations. And in this graph, I'm plotting the speedup of the manual instrumented applications compared to the automatic version generated using this support available on GNU C compiler. As we can see, the blue bars are always taller than, or in most of the applications taller than, the automatic version. That means that there's a huge gap between the performance of manually instrumented code and automatic instrumented code. For that reason, it's very unlikely that newcomers will decide to use transactional memory, because the performance that they can obtain through the easiest way of applying transactional memory is really bad. So the main takeaway of this presentation is that we proposed a very simple mechanism to annotate variables that don't need any synchronization. Take this example, for instance. We have a function that compares two strings, and if we know that the strings are private or they don't require synchronization to be accessed, we can very easily annotate them with a TM-elide annotation, and that means the compiler is going to elide all the barriers involved to access both strings. And if we do that in a real application from the STAMP benchmark, we can achieve up to 7 times speedup by just annotating a couple lines of code. The main contributions of this paper are: first, we introduced the first, as far as we know, implementation of transactional memory for Clang and an LVM compiler framework. Our implementation works as a drop-in replacement of GCC. So if you have code that works with the GNU C compiler, you don't need to change anything to compile with Clang. Second, we propose a transactional memory annotation that helps programmers to elide memory barriers from transactional code, and they can be very easily used, as in the previous example. Third, we created a profiling tool that is targeted to aid programmers to identify elision opportunities. And last, using the transactional memory annotation, TM-elide, we show that gains up to 7 times are achievable when we elide transactional barriers from transactional code. Well, transactional memory is a parallel programming model that is first introduced, or better, popularized by Hurley and Moss back in 2003. However, the fundamental ideas date back to 1977. The main goals of transactional memory are to make transactional synchronization transparent and increase both code reuse and composability. Transactions work with the main abstractions similar to data break transactions, where we abstract memory as databases and access them through transactions. So any memory access is synchronized and guaranteed to be consistent. Many transactional memory implementations exist. So we have hardware-based transactions available on commodity processors from Intel and IBM. We also have a variety of implementations on software. And both techniques can be coupled to produce what we call hybrid transactional memories. Compiler support for TM of today is mainly available through the GNU C compiler, and it's available since 2011. And however, it's the only implementation that supports transactional memory in the compiler for C and C++. The SG5 group, which is a C++ group focused on TM, tries to standardize TM for C++ since 2012. However, since the last proposal was submitted in 2017, the proposal was not accepted. And the main reason for the denying of the proposal is due to the lack of user experience. And that user experience has a lot to do with the performance we saw in the previous graph. There's a lot of works that already try to solve some of the performance issues related to compiler support of transactional memory. However, most of them rely on runtime solutions that try to remove unnecessary barriers from code at runtime. And because of that, they lack most of the source code level information that is lost when the code is compiled. Another problem is that they try to elide memory that was allocated inside transactions, and that kind of memory is not the main source of inefficiency. In this graph, I show a breakdown of memory access, showing access to the stack, the heap. We say others to mean any memory access that we don't know from where it came, that can either be from the stack or the heap. But those we know for sure the compiler inserted the barriers even though they were not necessary. And the green bars show the memory barriers that are actually necessary to guarantee consistency. So as you can see, most of the opportunities of elision are from the memory access the compiler fails to identify as unnecessary. Going back to the example, which comes from a real application in STEM, we can very easily remove the barriers from variables that we know for sure are private, or variables that never get updated inside transactions. And by doing that, we get a very significant speedup. So the proposed annotation, TM and light, is a very natural way to express private variables. And by allowing this expressiveness, we can rely on the transactional memory to not check conflicts on those variables. When those conflicts are not checked because they are not necessary and they will never happen, we reduce the amount of false conflicts in the application. And that eliminates most of the unnecessary overhead we see from automatic instrumented transactional code. But most of the hard aspects of eliding transactional memory barriers come from how to identify the problematic barriers. And to solve that, we created a profiling tool that helps programmers to identify opportunities for elision. Second happens when you need to remove barriers across function calls. And that happens mostly when programmers are passing variables as pointers to other functions. And when you do that, you might lose a lot of type information that was previously available at the source code level, but is not available anymore at the intermediate representation level. In order to solve that, we need to bridge the gap between the abstract syntax tree and the intermediate representation. As we can see, the annotation is very clear to identify at the source code level or the AST level. However, the information is not present anymore at the LVMIR level, which is used for optimization. Our solution is to leverage on debug information that is already inserted by compilers to binaries that traditionally are used for the debugging phase of applications. The debug information compilers already insert are basically the file name, the source code line, and other type information. We propose to extend the type by adding a tag, which we call tag tm_elide. That means this variable was previously annotated with tm_elide and doesn't require any transactional memory barrier. The Transactionify transformation was implemented as a self-contained LLVM pass, so you don't need to integrate the code into LLVM to use it. It's 100% compatible with GCC transactional memory support, so legacy code or any code that's ready to compile with GCC, we also work with Clang. We leverage LLVM metadata to identify transactional memory variables that were annotated with tm_elide to avoid instrumenting unnecessary memory accesses. In order to help programmers to identify opportunities for elision, we create a profiling tool that reports very accurate source location of the most accessed memory barriers. So in this way, programmers can know exactly in which file, which function, and at line the barrier is being called, and with the knowledge of the application, the programmer can very easily determine if that variable needs synchronization or not. Our experimental setup is the following. We used a Xeon 18-core processor. We adopted the STAMP benchmark, which is the standard for evaluating transactional memory. We compared the performance by compiling code with both GNU-C compiler at version 7.3 and Clang version 6.1. One important aspect of our methodology is that all binaries were generated by compiling exactly the same source code. In this table, we show how easy and how effective transactional memory elision can be. In the column Clang TM plus tm_elide, we see that up to 99.7% of the barriers can be eliminated by just annotating a few lines of code. This shows that the programmer, don't need to spend a lot of time finding barriers to elide because it can rely on our profiling tool. And by just annotating a couple of source code lines, you can reduce significantly the amount of transactional memory barriers that are not necessary. In this slide, I show the performance of eliding transactional memory in the Genome application. In the y-axis, we see the speedup. In the x-axis, we see the number of threads used to execute the application. We have 4 points in each execution. The green bar shows the manually annotated transactions. The pink bar shows the transactional annotated with the compiler support in Clang that we implemented, and also with the tm_elide annotations to elide the barriers that are not necessary. As we can see, the pink bar is very tall compared to the bar in blue or in orange, meaning that it's much faster than the baseline implementation of Clang TM in both GCC TM, showing that it was very effective to elide the unnecessary barriers from the code. We can also see that the pink bar is very close to the green bar, showing that we were successful to elide transactional memory barriers to reach a very close performance to the manual instrumentation code. This other result also shows very interesting results, showing that we can gain up to 20% in the vacation application. And in this case, it's interesting because our data flow analysis was able to elide transactional memory barriers that were not elided by GCC. And by eliding additional barriers using the TM-elide annotation, didn't improve the performance so much. So from our work, we can conclude that first, we showed a drop-in replacement of GCC support for transactional memory in Clang LLVM compiler framework that can be used to compile legacy or code ready for GCC. Second, that the TM-elide is a very efficient and easy annotation to use to elide transactional memory barriers. Third, that a tool that is very simple to use and to understand can be very efficient to identify elision opportunities. Last, we show that gains up to 7 times can be achieved by removing a couple of unnecessary barriers. And not only that, that in the worst case, the performance of the automatic code is only 8% slower than the manual instrumentation code. That's all for this video. I thank you for watching and hope to hear from you if you are interested in my research. That's it. Thank you.